Okay, welcome to this event by the Center of Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gange. I am the center's coordinator, and I will also be today's moderator. More importantly, today's speaker is Robert Piercey with the topic, Is Ricoeur Still Relevant to the Philosophy of History? Robert is professor of philosophy at the University of Regina, as I just learned shortly before this how it's pronounced, in Canada. And his main research interests lie, among other things, in the historiography of philosophy, the philosophy of history, and pragmatism. And Robert is also the editor of the journal Philosophy in Review. Now, of Robert's many publications, his books and his articles, I only want to mention a few here that I think are relevant and have a bearing on today's topic, but I invite you all to have a look at his long and accomplished list of publications. Now, on the topic of Ricoeur, Robert has most recently published a paper, Too Many Hegels, ? Ricoeur's Relation to German Idealism Reconsidered, which was published in the Palgrave Handbook of German Idealism and Phenomenology. In the Philosophy of History, more generally, Robert published in 2017 in the Journal of the Philosophy of History the intriguingly titled paper, Narcissism or Fact, ? A pragmatist approach to the philosophy of history. And I have it just right here next to me. I started reading it shortly before. And if you're interested in a pragmatist account of facts in the philosophy of historiography or a neo-pragmatist account, then I can very much recommend the paper to you. Robert is also together with Serge Grigoriev, guest editor of the special issue on pragmatism of the Journal of the Philosophy of History, which appeared as the issue 3/2019 of the journal. Further is Robert also the author of several books, of which I want to mention two here. One is called The Uses of the Past from Heidegger to Rorty, Doing Philosophy Historically, which came out in 2009 with Cambridge University Press. And the other is The Crisis of Continental Philosophy, History, Truth, and the Hegelian Legacy, which came out in the same year with Continuum Press. Now, this is the fourth and final session of our autumn seminar, which has been taking place from September until now. But worry not, our motto is after the seminar is before the seminar. So we are currently already planning our spring seminar, which will take place from February to May. However, currently there are still, I think, 2 at least open slots. So if you would like to speak in our seminar, or you have somebody else you'd really like to hear speak in our seminar, then please contact us and we can see if we can make it happen. Also, please consider following our social media accounts, where we usually publicize this sort of events at our research seminar and other things. We have X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook, and we regularly there also publish other information and what we consider interesting stuff about the philosophy of history. Now, before I give the word to Robert, a few technicalities. Please mute yourself during the talk to avoid any unnecessary disturbance. After the talk, there will be a discussion session that I will moderate. If you have any comment in the discussion session, please indicate so first in the chat. I will make a speakers list. When it's your turn, please either speak up without your camera on or indicate your question in the chat or write your question in the chat and I will read it out loud. And we will prioritize people who have not spoken yet. Now, finally, thank you, Robert. Welcome to speak here in our seminar. The floor is yours. And I understand it's early with you and it's late with us, but for us, it's great to have you here. Please, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd be delighted to be here any day of the year, but I'm especially delighted to be with you on the shortest day of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. I live in a fairly remote part of Western Canada, and I often feel as though I'm at the extreme northern fringes of the philosophical world. So it's nice to be with philosophers who are even further north than I am. A couple of quick comments. I should warn you that in this building, the boiler is acting up. And if you hear god-awful mechanical grinding noises at some point, that's why. I hope it doesn't happen often. I hope it's not a disturbance, but I'll warn you that that might happen at some point. I also wanted to warn you, or tell you, I don't have a slideshow, so I'll simply be reading or speaking through my talk. If at any point there's something that you miss you'd like me to go back to, please let me know. One of the things, I should thank not only for his kind introduction, but for organizing this talk and inviting me. One of the things that I'd like to add to his very kind introduction is that if you know me, you know that I am a shameless dilettante. And I've never been one of these scholars who works doggedly in a single area. I've always been interested in exploring several different areas at the same time. And this paper is sort of an expression of that because it arises out of my long-standing interest in the philosophical hermeneutics of Paul Ricoeur, but bears on certain questions in the philosophy of history as well. Now, one of the downsides of being a dilettante, there are advantages, but one of the downsides is that one is often speaking to audiences who know far more about the particular topic you're addressing than one is oneself. That's, I'm sure, the case here. I'm sure everyone here knows much more about recent work in the philosophy of history than I do. So I think I stand to benefit from that because it means that I could perhaps get feedback from people here about how recent work in the philosophy of history does and doesn't bear on the developments I'm discussing here today. So I'll look forward to that in the discussion. And with those preliminaries out of the way, I'll just begin. When Paul Ricoeur's Time and Narrative was published, it was hailed as an important work in the philosophy of history. In his review of the English translation, Charles Reagan called the book a major contribution to the field, one that he predicted would have a profound effect on wider debates about the methods of the social sciences. The book defended a broadly narrativist approach to history. Against those who saw narrative as a dispensable heuristic device or a pitfall to avoid, Ricoeur argued that if history were not essentially narrative in character, it would lose its distinctive place in the chorus of the social sciences. At the same time, Ricoeur tempered some of the more sweeping claims about narrative that had recently been advanced by thinkers such as Hayden White, arguing that if history were nothing but another literary genre, then it would lose its scientific character and thus its distinctiveness. Time and Narrative also advanced a powerful critique of certain positions in the philosophy of history that downplayed the importance of narrative, especially logical empiricism and the historiography of the Annales school. In response to logical empiricists, who still tended to be under the sway of the covering law model, Ricoeur gave an original new account of the distinctiveness of historical narratives, according to which they are configurational rather than just episodic. As for the Annales school, Ricoeur argued that its break with agent-centered history was less complete than it appeared. As Ricoeur saw it, the school's histories of the longue durée, which initially seemed thoroughly non-narrative, were actually implicitly narrative in character, drawing their intelligibility from a surreptitious use of quasi-events, quasi-characters, and quasi-plots. In short, Time and Narrative gave a comprehensive picture of the writing of history that tried to acknowledge the discipline's scientific and literary sides without diminishing either. Jonathan Ray summed up the book's contribution by saying that Ricoeur had shown that both of these apparently contradictory approaches are correct. It has now been nearly 40 years since the third and final volume of Time and Narrative was published. In that time, the philosophy of history has changed dramatically. The approaches that Ricoeur criticized are nowhere near as common or as influential as they were then, and refuting them no longer looks like an urgent task. Logical empirists are thin on the ground these days, and the idea that the covering law model is shared by all genuine sciences has fallen out of favor in most circles. For its part, the Annales school has not disappeared, but its stance, I think, is moderated, with few of its current members willing to say without qualification that human agents and intentions have no legitimate role in the writing of history. Perhaps more importantly, several of Ricoeur's own claims about narrative have been sharply criticized during the last 4 decades, and ideas that he took as self-evident now seem questionable to many. On one side, literary theorists have criticized Ricoeur for, as they see it, getting narrative wrong. That is, for misidentifying the essential features of narrative. As you will see, Ricoeur thought that the essence of narrative was figuration, the process of synthesizing events, characters, and other elements into larger wholes, thereby giving them meanings they did not have before. Emplotment, or the creation of stories with beginnings, middles, and ends, is the best known example of this process. Some recent theorists of narrative, however, see plot as a secondary or even dispensable feature and argue that the essence of narrative lies elsewhere. Monika Fludernik, for instance, has argued that the kind of figuration involved in emplotment is not essential to narrative at all. What is essential to it, she argues, is the representation of experientiality, or what she calls the quasi-mimetic evocation of real-life experience. She therefore criticizes Ricoeur for, as she sees it, ignoring the experiential side of historical narrative. From another direction, some have argued that even if Ricoeur is right about the nature of narrative, he overstates its importance for the writing of history. An especially clear version of this criticism has been advanced by Jouni-Matti Kuukkanen, who argues that narrativists such as Ricoeur are right to claim that the basic unit of history writing is the complete text, and to insist that every text contains some content synthesizing entity that combines its individual claims into something larger. But they are wrong to suggest that narrative is the only thing capable of performing this synthesis. Other things can do it just as well, and as a result, history is not essentially narrative in character. In short, both literary theory and the philosophy of history have moved on since the appearance of time and narrative. So we should ask, is Ricoeur's narrativism still relevant to the philosophy of history? Does he still offer something to those who reflect philosophically on history today? I intend to argue that he does. I agree that over the last 4 decades, literary theorists and philosophers have made important contributions to our understanding of narrative, what it is, how it functions, and why it matters to a wide range of practices. In many ways, this work marks a real advance over Ricoeur's narrativism. Nevertheless, I think we have not yet grasped the power and sophistication of Ricoeur's account of narrative. And in particular, we have not fully appreciated what it offers philosophers of history. In part, this is for the familiar reason that Ricoeur's critics have not always understood his arguments, which may well be true of everyone who has ever criticized anything. But there are also 2 larger issues at play. One is that many of the specific claims about history that Ricoeur defends in Time and Narrative are not fully intelligible on their own. They make sense only in the context of the book's project as a whole, and that project, in turn, is fully intelligible only in the context of Ricoeur's larger project in philosophical hermeneutics, a project in which he was engaged from the late 1950s until his death in 2005. One can hardly blame Ricoeur's critics for treating his specific theses in isolation. Time and Narrative is a huge, rambling book, and as Wendell Harris said upon its publication, its effect is that of a rich miscellany, rather than a tightly unified argument. Still, if we do not pay attention to what Ricoeur is trying to do with his particular theses and arguments, we will miss important features of his position. The second larger issue is related. Since Ricoeur's narrativism is an interconnected whole, it must be assessed as an interconnected whole. The right question to ask about it is not whether its claims about, say, narrative sentences or explanation are uncontestable on their own. The right question to ask is how well Ricoeur's position as a whole compares with those articulated by his critics. And here, I think, Ricoeur's narrativism fares remarkably well. In many cases, the alternatives presented by Ricoeur's critics either fail to solve certain difficulties that Ricoeur himself addresses nicely, or else give rise to new problems that are more serious than the ones that face Ricoeur. When Ricoeur's narrativism as a whole is compared with its competitors, it looks quite attractive, even 40 years later. My argument falls into 4 steps. First, I will reconstruct Ricoeur's narrativism and place it in its larger context. That context is provided by Ricoeur's decades-long study of semantic innovation, the process through which the productive imagination brings new meanings into existence, meanings which make it possible to refer to reality in previously unimagined ways. Second, I will describe a criticism that has been directed at Ricoeur by literary theorists who think he misidentifies the essential features of narrative. My main interlocutor on this point will be Monika Fludernik. I will describe the criticism she makes of Ricoeur in her 2010 book, Towards a Natural Narratology, and explain why I find them unconvincing. Third, I will discuss the criticisms that have been made of Ricoeur's brand of narrativism by post-narrativist philosophers of history. Here I will engage with the views of Jouni-Matti Kuukkanen, as expressed in his 2015 book, Post-narrativist Philosophy of Historiography. Finally, I will argue that Ricoeur's narrativism has powerful advantages over the alternatives articulated by his critics. I will conclude by summarizing what I think remains viable in Ricoeur's philosophy of history and sketching some of the ways in which contemporary philosophy might be able to build on it. Finally, some caveats. First, my discussion of Ricoeur's philosophy of history will focus almost entirely on the 3 volumes of Time and Narrative. I will have little to say about the many other texts in which Ricoeur discusses history and narrative. And in particular, I will have nothing to say about his second big book on these topics, 2000's Memory, History, Forgetting. This is the book for which Emmanuel Macron was the research assistant. This is not because these other texts are unimportant. In many cases, they develop Ricoeur's thinking about history and narrative in important ways. But with very few exceptions, these other texts either anticipate or amplify views that Ricoeur first articulates in Time and Narrative. That book is the fullest and clearest statement of Ricoeur's views on narrative, so it will be my focus here. My second caveat is that throughout this paper, I will use the term philosophy of history to refer both to reflections on past events and reflections on historians thinking about past events. In doing so, I will break with a now widespread practice of using the term philosophy of historiography to refer to reflections on the historian's craft, and restricting the term philosophy of history to reflections on the nature of the past and its phenomena themselves. My reason is simply that this is how Ricoeur uses the term. He does not speak of a distinct enterprise called the philosophy of historiography, so using that term to discuss his views would insert an awkward distance between his views and my reconstruction. I realize that by not using this term, I will be characterizing the views of others in ways they would not accept. For that, I apologize. But since my main goal here is to discuss Ricoeur's views, using his terminology seems like the best choice overall. So let me start with a brief overview of Ricoeur's narrativism. Time and narrative touches on many different debates, and to some extent, Ricoeur's motives are those of anyone intervening in these debates, to discover the correct view about, say, singular causal imputation, or the relation between explanation and understanding. But as I have suggested, Ricoeur's narrativism is also motivated by a larger goal. That goal is to extend a project in which Ricoeur had been engaged since the late 1950s, a project focused on the role of the imagination in culture. The sort of imagination with which Ricoeur is concerned is the productive imagination, understood largely as Kant understood it. It is the imagination considered as active and constructive, the ability to organize the elements of experience by generating schemata that link them. The main difference between Kant's view of the productive imagination and Ricoeur's is that Ricoeur conceives of it as a linguistic ability. The creative, synthesizing ability of the productive imagination unfolds not in the acts of a transcendental ego, but in certain sorts of discourse. Specifically, it is figurative language, language that goes beyond the established literal meanings of words, that schematizes experience by actively linking present elements to absent ones. In short, Ricoeur argues that the productive imagination is at work in the phenomenon of semantic innovation, or the generation of new meanings that allow us to refer to reality in previously unimagined ways. Ricoeur thought this process unfolded on 3 different levels, and he spent more than 30 years exploring them in turn. The first and simplest level is that of the symbol. At this level, most fully described in Ricoeur's 1960 book, The Symbolism of Evil, single words stand for objects very different from themselves, and thus show them in a new light. The second level is metaphor, which uses complete sentences to carry out what Ricoeur calls impertinent predication. A metaphor says that one thing is something else that it literally is not. In doing so, it discloses real aspects of the thing that went unnoticed before the metaphor existed. Schematization through metaphor was the subject of Ricoeur's 1975 book, The Rule of Metaphor, or lively metaphor would be a better translation. At the third and final level, narrative, the productive imagination uses complete texts with plots to effect a higher order synthesis of the heterogeneous. By means of the plot, Ricoeur argues, goals, causes, and chance are brought together within the temporal unity of a whole and complete action. This process gives the elements a meaning they did not have before, namely the meaning that comes from the specific roles they play in a larger story. I realize that the details of Ricoeur's project will not interest everyone, but they do establish something important. Like symbols and metaphors, narratives interest Ricoeur because he thinks they put us in touch with a different kind of sense-making than the ones found in everyday literal discourse. Everyday language involves what he calls a combinatory rationality that gathers pre-given elements without transforming them, much as, for Kant, the empirical or reproductive imagination links data in a passive, mechanical way. The figurative language used in narrative does something qualitatively different. Ricoeur calls it a competence for producing new logical species, in spite of the resistance of our current categorizations of language. It is important to bear this point in mind because many of the criticisms of narrativism that one hears nowadays, sometimes aimed at Ricoeur, sometimes not, seem to presuppose that narrative is purely combinatory. They apparently assume that narratives simply assemble existing information without transforming it, telling us, for example, that one thing happened and then another thing happened, and so on. These critics then point out, quite reasonably, that merely combining extant data teaches us little of interest, and they conclude that narrative is dispensable or worse. But Ricoeur, for one, never took narrative to be the humdrum combining of extant data through plot. He always took it to involve the generation of a new sort of insight, a new kind of meaning, through the schematizing power of the productive imagination. Though Ricoeur would resist this way of putting it, its product is more like understanding than knowledge. That is, a holistic sense of the relations among bits of information and of their significance. Criticisms of Ricoeur that overlook this point tend to get off on the wrong foot. What new form of insight does narrative offer? Ricoeur answers this question in the first chapter of Time and Narrative, which argues that narrative transforms our relationship to time. This is an urgent matter for Ricoeur, since he thinks time is an essentially aporetic phenomenon. Drawing on Augustine's reflections in Book 11 of the Confessions, he claims that there can be no coherent theory of what time is or how it can be measured. But we cannot stop trying to make sense of time, since, in a way, we are time. Our existence is temporal all the way down. We need some way of humanizing time, some way of domesticating it by grasping it indirectly through the mediation of something else. This something else is narrative, the symbolically mediated representation of action. Time, Ricoeur argues, becomes human time to the extent that it is organized after the manner of a narrative. Narrative, in turn, is meaningful to the extent that it portrays the features of temporal experience. This language might suggest that narrative falsifies time by imposing an order that is not inherent in it. But Ricoeur's view is quite a bit more complicated. The representation of time through structures with beginnings, middles, and ends takes place at three distinct levels, he argues. All three levels imitate actions, so Ricoeur calls them, seriously and playfully, mimesis 1, mimesis 2, and mimesis 3. Mimesis 1 concerns the prefiguration of action. Ricoeur argues that before actions are explicitly narrated in written or spoken stories, they already possess an implicitly narrative character, thanks to the means-end structure of action and the protension-retention structure of temporal experience. There are, so to speak, proto-narratives waiting to be told, but they do not exist as narratives unless someone explicitly tells them. This telling occurs at the second level, mimesis 2. It involves configuration, or the construction of explicit plots which bring together agents, goals, means, circumstances, and unintended results into unified structures. Mimesis 3, or refiguration, is the process through which the readers of a narrative integrate it into their own life stories, determining what it has to say about their own existential situations. Much as Gadamer hermeneutics claims that understanding is completed in application, Ricoeur insists that a narrative is not fully realized until it is concretized by interpreters in this way. This tripartite scheme involves a subtle mix of creativity and constraint. When we construct a plot through mimesis 2 and apply that plot to our own situations through mimesis 3, we are not free to do whatever we like. We are explicating a prior structure to which we are answerable. At the same time, we are not simply replicating a pre-given object exactly as it is. Our imaginative, figurational activity transforms what existed at the prior level. Thus, the texts produced by historians and by writers of fiction are not simply found, but neither are they simply made. As we will see, this complex interweaving of finding and making helps Ricoeur to navigate between some of the extreme positions advanced by other narrativists. What does all this mean for the work of historians? Ricoeur sees the study of history as one of the two main areas of culture concerned with the products of narrative configuration, the other being literary fiction. Ricoeur's basic claim is that any position in the philosophy of history that tries to dispense with narrative altogether is a non-starter. As he puts it, history cannot sever every connection with narrative without losing its historical character. Notice how guarded his language is in the quotation. History cannot sever every connection with narrative. There must be some link between a piece of history and narrative structure. Precisely what kind of link there must be is another question, and one to which I will return. For now, suffice it to say that the link can, and indeed must, be indirect. Historical writing need not take the form of explicit stories with straightforward plots, characters, and events. On the contrary, Ricoeur has a decidedly low opinion of what he calls this naive narrative style of writing, since he thinks it leaves insufficient room for explanation in terms of laws. Naive narrative also fails to recognize history's aspirations to objectivity, its hope that different investigations can be combined and mutually correct one another. In all of these respects, Ricoeur's claims about the role of narrative in history are more modest than one might expect. In the 1980s, however, even these modest claims were controversial. The covering law model was still considered a live option in many circles. The work of the Annales historians, with their focus on a seemingly plotless longue durée, was still relatively novel and considered promising by many. In that context, defending narrativism of any sort was still a fairly radical gesture. But alas, the 1980s are long gone. It is now tempting to write off Ricoeur's outlook as a product of its time, a critique of views that no longer have much appeal, and an overblown defense of insights that could be better accommodated in very different sorts of positions. With that in mind, let me now turn to the question of how Ricoeur's narrativism is viewed today, especially by his critics. The first critic I will discuss is Monika Fludernik. In her book, Towards a Natural Narratology, Fludernik develops an approach to narrative that differs significantly from Ricoeur's. It differs first in its methodology, that is, in its view of how narrative ought to be investigated, and of which sorts of evidence ought to determine our position on this topic. As we've seen, Ricoeur's position is grounded in a sort of phenomenological description. He defends it with a series of observations about the first-person experience of time, particularly observations about the mute, aporetic character of that experience. Ricoeur argues that since it is impossible to give a coherent account of what time is, we must make sense of it indirectly through the mediation of narrative. By contrast, Fludernik argues that our view of narrative should be grounded in a different sort of evidence, namely evidence from discourse analysis and cognitive linguistics. These fields, as she describes them, try to locate linguistic processes within more general processes of cognitive comprehension. They study linguistic processes insofar as they relate to human embodiness in a natural environment. The term natural, therefore, designates a particular frame through which we may view language, a frame that is oriented toward human embodiedness. This frame highlights features of language use that are naturally occurring or constitutive of prototypical human experience. Fludernik therefore insists the term natural does not have prescriptive or moralistic connotations, but merely designates a way of studying language that is guided by descriptive evidence about how people actually use narrative in everyday life. By contrast, I take it, Ricoeur's approach is more concerned with the deeper metaphysical significance of how people use those structures. For example, with the idea that deep down, what we are doing when we tell stories is humanizing time. Fludernik argues that these natural narratives are to be found in what she calls spontaneous conventional storytelling, not in what she calls institutionalized literary storytelling, but storytelling as it proceeds unselfconsciously in everyday life. Examples include the telling of jokes and anecdotes, the retelling of other people's experiences, narratives of vicarious experience, bare reports and summaries of events, and the telling of imaginary scenarios. These are obviously not the only forms of storytelling, but in Fludernik's view, they are the prototypical ones, and they tell us more about the workings of narrativity, even in more complex texts, than other forms do. Fludernik's analysis of these natural narratives is varied and complex, and I will not try to summarize it in its entirety. Her main conclusion, however, is that spontaneous conventional storytelling is not centrally concerned with plots or chronology. Spontaneous stories can have plots, but producing plots is not their goal, and it is not what makes them successful or unsuccessful. Instead, their goal is emotional involvement, making their audience feel invested in the experience being narrated, and in its evaluation. Doing this well, she argues, requires the quasi-mimetic evocation of real-life experience, a successful depiction of what it is like to inhabit a given situation and to live through certain experiences. Whatever else this requires, it does not require the experiences being represented to be shaped into structures with beginnings, middles, and ends. Fludernik concludes that there can therefore be narratives without plot, but there cannot be any narratives without a human anthropomorphic experiencer of some sort at some narrative level. Since Ricoeur does define narrative in terms of configuration through plot, Fludernik thinks he misidentifies its essential features. Fludernik further argues that Ricoeur's privileging of plot over experientiality leads to two other difficulties. First, it makes his account inappropriately teleological. When we shape events into plot, she argues, we seek to give them the sense of an ending. The events in a narrative acquire new significance by virtue of their role in the larger movement towards a suitable endpoint that resolves the tension inherent in the initial situation. Fludernik equates this new significance with the contribution that the events make to the narrative's resolution. Configuring events into a plot transforms the succession of chronologically ordered events into one meaningful whole, into the narrative's point or theme, and retroactively defines previous stages as inevitably contributing to the endpoint. She therefore says that for Ricoeur, narration is a process of chronological rearrangement with a view towards ulterior teleological resolution. Fludernik worries that this process can impose an order on events that they do not really possess. To depict events as leading inevitably to a particular endpoint is to make life seem neater and more orderly than it actually is. The second difficulty that Fludernik sees in Ricoeur's account concerns historical experience. Since Fludernik thinks that the essence of narrative is the representation of agential experience, historical narratives in particular must represent experience as well. But experience, she says, is curiously absent from Ricoeur's view of narrative. Because he defines historical narrative in terms of configuration into plots, the peculiar dynamic of narrative experience, she says, never enters the picture. This is, I believe, particularly detrimental to Ricoeur's otherwise so insightful discussion of historiographic narrative. That was a quotation. His philosophy of history contains no requirement that historical narratives depict the essential experience of the events undergone by historical agents. Fludernik's view seems to be that any successful piece of historical writing must shed light on what it was like for agents to live through the events being described. Ricoeur's philosophy of history includes no such requirement, and so it overlooks the distinctive kind of insight the study of history offers. What should we make of Fludernik's criticisms? The first thing to note is that they are based on a decidedly narrow view of historical inquiry. Like all narratives, historical narratives must represent the experiences of the agents they depict. But that, it seems, is all they must do. They need not perform any of the other functions that philosophers of history have attributed to them. They do not have to explain events. They do not have to identify the causes of events. They do not even have to be followable in the sense that each of their steps must be a natural outcome of preceding ones. All of these functions seem to be absent from Fludernik's account. Nor does this absence look like mere oversight. Fludernik appears to have a very narrow view of what historians do. Most historical writing, she says, appears to emerge from two needs: the necessity of fixing in writing what is fast receding from common memory, and the conscious interpretation of past events in the light of present concerns. Fixing in writing seems to involve preserving facts that are in danger of being forgotten. For instance, that Joe Biden legitimately won the last American presidential election. The conscious interpretation of past events in light of present concerns seems to involve revising settled interpretations that now seem inadequate, as in attempts by American historians to situate the recent actions of Republicans in a larger story about the global history of fascism. Both tasks are important, but they do not come close to exhausting the historian's task. They concern only the simplest and most pedestrian parts of historical inquiry, stating what happened and occasionally revising our statements about what happened. Indeed, Fludernik admits as much. She says that in her view, history is frequently bare of personal interest, precisely because it need not attach any importance to the hopes, fears, and other experiences of historical actors. It is, she claims, much less interesting than literature, which usually deals with the extraordinary achievements, adventures, or sufferings of a character. In short, Fludernik's view of historical narrative seems to presuppose that historians do not do much, and that what little they do is not very interesting. Such a view, I suspect, would not be shared by most of those who reflect philosophically on history. But what about the substance of Fludernik's claims? What about the claim that Ricoeur's approach to historical narrative ignores the experiences of agents? It would be strange indeed if Ricoeur's narrativism ignored experience, since its main motivation is precisely to come to terms with the experience of time. For Ricoeur, as we have seen, narrative is a way of humanizing time, a way of coming to terms with the mysterious and confusing aspects of temporal experience as it is actually lived. When Fludernik says that Ricoeur ignores the peculiar dynamic of narrative experience, she must mean that he ignores the sorts of experiences that she thinks are expressed in natural storytelling, which is to say, experiences presenting spontaneously and directly, without the mediation of institutionalized literary forms. It is certainly true that narrative, as Ricoeur understands it, does not present the experiences of historical agents immediately or directly. But that is because Ricoeur thinks it is impossible to do so. As we have seen, the starting point of his narrativism is the claim that time is an essentially apparatic phenomenon, and that our experiences of it are too confused to understand directly. When we try to present temporal experience immediately or directly, the best we can do is say the sorts of things that Augustine says in Book 11 of the Confessions, that if no one asks me what time is, I know, but if I want to explain it, I do not know. Of course, Ricoeur's claims about the aporias of temporal experience could be wrong. In that case, however, we would need an explanation of why they are wrong. We cannot criticize Ricoeur for failing to do something that he insists cannot be done. Nor does the story end there. Though Ricoeur argues that temporal experience cannot be depicted directly or immediately, he does think it can be represented in an indirect, mediated way. As he sees it, that is precisely what the study of history does. It mediates between lived phenomenological time and objective cosmic time by constituting a third time, specifically historical time. The distinctive tools used by historians, tools such as archives and documents, calendar time, concepts such as generations, form a bridge between the temporality of first-person experience and the third-person perspective on time employed by, say, physics. By bridging these very different perspectives on time, historical narratives ensure that even our most abstract theorizing about this phenomenon continues to represent the experience of historical agents. It merely does so in an indirect, mediated way. Finally, what about the worry that representing historical events through narrative form imposes an inappropriate teleology on them? Clearly, it may do so. I suspect we can all think of histories and biographies that impose an overly neat organization on their subjects, making events appear simpler and resolutions more conclusive than they actually are. It may even be that narratives always risk doing so, and that those who tell stories about actual events must be vigilant in resisting the temptation. But I see no reason to assume that narratives always distort events in this way. To make that assumption is to conflate two distinct claims. One is the claim that, to the extent that we understand events and lives, we understand them through narrative, since that is the form that our understanding of temporal developments must take. The other is the claim that we usually or always succeed in understanding events and lives in this way. The first claim does not entail the second. That we seek to tell coherent stories about lives and events does not require that we generally succeed in doing so. It may well be that we always try to fit events into orderly narratives with clear teleologies, but that we manage to do so rarely, if ever. This is actually a point on which Ricoeur insists. He says that his thesis in Time and Narrative is that time becomes human time to the extent that it is organized after the manner of a narrative. But he then hastens to add that we often fail to organize it to a great extent at all. There are, he says, always multiple plots for the same course of events, and they always get articulated in terms of fragmentary temporalities. Indeed, our failure to fit events into a tidy package can itself be a source of insight. Time and Narrative contains nuanced readings of the novels of Thomas Mann, Marcel Proust, and Virginia Woolf, readings which argue that the distinctive insights offered by modernist literature are bound up with trying to fit life into orderly structures, failing to do so, and learning something from that failure. In short, narrativism does not require that the narratives we tell about the past be simple or simplifying ones. To that extent, Fludernik's charge of inappropriate teleology misses the mark. The next critic I will discuss is Jouni-Matti Kuukkanen. Hi. But I should note at the outset that, in a sense, it is quite unfair of me to describe Kuukkanen as a critic of Ricoeur's. In his book, Post-narrativist Philosophy of Historiography, Kuukkanen advances a number of criticisms of narrative approaches to the philosophy of history in general. But while he lists Ricoeur as an example of a narrativist philosopher, he does not focus on Ricoeur while discussing the problems faced by narrative. The bulk of his discussion is instead devoted to other narrativists, especially Frank Ankersmit. In what follows, therefore, I do not wish to suggest that Kuukkanen gets Ricoeur wrong, as though we have the goal of criticizing Ricoeur's specific claims about history, but fail to achieve that goal. Rather, my claim is that Kuukkanen makes several important criticisms of narrativism in general, and that to the extent that Ricoeur is a narrativist, he needs to be able to respond to these criticisms, even though these criticisms are not directed at Ricoeur in the first instance. As I suspect everyone listening to me knows, Kuukkanen defends an approach to philosophizing about history that he calls post-narrativist. Post-narrativism is not exactly a repudiation of narrativism. It tries to preserve and build on the narrativist insight that history is written in complete texts that are more than the sum of their constituent sentences. But as I understand it, it claims that when narrativists tried to articulate that insight 40 years ago, they overreached. Post-narrativism thus seeks to rein in what it sees as the excesses of narrativism. It tries to show that whatever insights the narrativists had may be accommodated within a much more modest outlook that does not see history as essentially narrative in character. To do this, Kuukkanen gives a new account of the synthetic character of historical scholarship. The study of history is an integrative activity. Historians discover and bring together pieces of information, but they communicate this information through complete texts. As a result, only reading the whole text reveals its message fully. History books include integrated views, theses, or claims, and all the hundreds of pages and their sentences and statements are designed to explicate and ground those. Integration requires some content synthesizing entity, capable of mediating these sentences and statements, generating a higher level meaning not reducible to them. Up to this point, Kuukkanen and Ricoeur are in agreement. But Kuukkanen thinks that the narrativism of the 1980s goes beyond this minimal claim about the mechanics of history writing. As he reconstructs it, narrativism is a more ambitious outlook, marked by three key theses: representationalism, constructivism, and holism. Representationalism is the view that there has been a past that historians should copy as well as they can in the language they use for writing about it. They may disagree about what precisely histories represent: the past itself, aspects of the past, traces of the past, but they agree that historians strive to represent what has happened by constructing stories about it. Constructivism is the view that these representations of the past are not mere copies of something independent, but are shaped by historians' activity. As Ankersmit puts it, the historical landscape is not given to the historian. He has to construct it. Historians do this by imposing a structure on past events that is allegedly absent from the events themselves: narrative structure. On this view, as Kuukkanen describes it, there is no untold story in the past. There is nothing to tell and nothing to discover. The past only becomes narratively structured through the imagination and the hand of the historian. As a result, there are no translation rules that govern the relationship between the past as given and the representation of the past as represented by the historian. Historians must decide how to represent the past. Multiple stories are always possible, and the past does not uniquely vindicate any one of them. Finally, holism is the view that a narrative cannot be decomposed into its constituent parts without losing its identity. We must not cherry-pick historical claims from a historiographical text, since the meanings of these claims is shaped by the larger narrative structures in which they appear. In reading a work of history, we must try to understand what kind of story, message, or thesis a work of history as a whole amounts to. That meaning is never just a sum of the meanings of its individual sentences. Understood in this way, narrativism strikes Kuukkanen as implausible. He accepts constructivism, agreeing that we do not simply find the historical landscape, but must produce it. But he rejects its other tenets, giving three arguments against them. First, he claims that if narrativism were true, there would exist no non-narrative histories. But there are non-narrative histories. For instance, medieval annals that seem to merely record a year and an event or events without offering commentary or links, and chronicles that merely list events in a chronological order. Hence, by modus tollens, narrativism cannot be true. Second, the holism of narrativism entails absurd consequences. For one thing, holism, quote, is very demanding with regard to the reader. In order to comprehend the historian's narrative and acquire historical knowledge, the reader should be able to know the whole narrative and all the events that are part of it. All the events and statements of those events are definitionally part of the narrative. Without all the statements of events, there is no narrative. And without the entire narrative, there is no adequate historiographical comprehension of those statements. This view raises awkward questions. Suppose I understand all the statements in a history book except one. Does it follow that I do not understand the book's argument, or that I gain no historical knowledge from it? The holist seems to have to say yes, since each statement is definitionally part of the narrative. And that seems absurd. Finally, Kuukkanen argues that narrativism entails a view of historical argumentation that is wrong-headed, even degrading. Narratives are descriptive. So to see histories as narratives is to suggest that historians merely report what happened first, what happened next, and thereafter, and still further on, etc. Even if a narrative manages somehow to endow surplus meaning to the events, this does not seem to capture the ambition or sophistication of what historians actually do. Historians rightly see their enterprise as a rational and perhaps scientific one. They advance knowledge claims and justify them to their peers. On that basis alone, a new outlook seems called for, one that sees history as a rational practice and not as a kind of narrative storytelling. The alternative Kuukkanen proposes sees history as presentations rather than representations. Again, I'm sure everyone listening knows this quite well. On this view, complete texts do something that individual sentences do not, but they are not justified in virtue of accurately mirroring an object called the past. They are justified instead through the humdrum workings of what Sellers and Brandom call the game of giving and asking for reasons. To advance a claim is to make a particular kind of move in this game, to commit oneself to defending it by advancing some further claim. Each new move, each new commitment and defense takes place within the game, within the logical space of reasons. Historians defend their views to one another by citing familiar workaday values, coherence, scope, originality, for instance. Doing so can involve placing claims in the context of some more sweeping narrative, but it need not. In any case, what does the justificatory work here is the particular reasons asked for and given, not some referential relation between a narrative and the past. For that reason, just as there is nothing to be gained by saying that a history represents the past as it really was, there is nothing to be gained by asking whether the presentation it makes is true. When a historian manages to give reasons in defense of her claims, those claims can be said to be rationally warranted or justified. The inferential practice of giving reasons is thus itself a form of justification. Truth is superfluous here, and Kuukkanen suggests that we replace it with the pragmatist notion of warranted assertability. I do not, he says, see why the truth would be necessary in the game of giving and asking reasons. I see the appeal of post-narrativism. There certainly were defenses of narrative in the 1970s and 1980s that went too far, treating historical scholarship as purely literary and insufficiently scientific. Post-narrativism offers a valuable corrective to some of those tendencies. But the question I would like to raise here is whether Kuukkanen's criticisms of narrativism in general apply to Ricoeur's narrativism in particular. For the most part, I think they do not. Let us start with the objection that if narrativism were true, there would be no non-narrative histories, which there clearly are. The force of this objection depends on what we mean by narrative. If we mean explicit narratives, narratives that are expressly presented as structures with beginnings, middles, and ends, then the objection has great force, because, as Kuukkanen points out, annals and chronicles are not always presented in this form. But Ricoeur does not claim that all histories must be explicit narratives. On the contrary, he draws a sharp distinction between what he calls narrative history and the narrative character of history. And he says that my thesis concerning the narrative character of history is in no way to be confused with a defense of narrative history. What he claims is that there must be an indirect connection between history and our narrative competence, such that every history is bound to our narrative understanding by a line of derivation that we can reconstruct step by step and degree by degree with an appropriate method, even those that are most removed from narrative form. In other words, a piece of history that we can follow and learn something from is one that is capable of being translated into an explicit story, even though, much of the time, we do not translate it. Some pieces of historical scholarship look so different from explicit stories that it can be hard to imagine how this translation could go. This may be true of many works of the Annales school, which can seem devoid of agents or actions of any sort. But even here, Ricoeur argues, we invariably find certain relay stations leading from the events constructed by the historian back to the characters and narrative. Brodel's History of the Mediterranean, for example, does not contain conventional characters who perform conventional actions, but it does contain what Ricoeur calls quasi-characters, territories such as the sea, the mountains, and the inland plains, for instance, that give the work its subject matter and its coherence. Similarly, Brodel's focus on longue durée might seem to deprive his history of the events that make up plots, but there are what Ricoeur calls quasi-events that unfold with a slower rhythm, the gradual passing of political influence from one peninsula to another, for instance. Wherever there is history, there is change. And according to Ricoeur, all change enters the field of history as a quasi-event. Quasi-events, in turn, make up quasi-plots, syntheses of heterogeneous elements. In his History of the Mediterranean, Ricoeur says, Brodel has invented a new type of plot, one that teaches us to unite structures, cycles, and events by joining together heterogeneous temporalities and contradictory chronicles. Ricoeur's claims here do have the effect of broadening the definition of narrative, perhaps to some unacceptably so. At a minimum, though, they show that the question of whether there are non-narrative histories is more complicated than it first appears. Kuukkanen's second objection to narrativism is that its holism leads to absurd consequences. If the vehicle of historical insight is the complete narrative, it seems to follow that everything in a narrative defines the narrative, and that we cannot understand any of the narrative without understanding all of it. I agree that this result is absurd, but I'm not sure that Ricoeur is vulnerable to it, because he would not accept the terms in which it is posed. To speak of individual sentences as parts of a narrative, and to see a complete narrative as a collection of these parts, is to think of the process of learning from narrative as a matter of acquiring information. It is indeed absurd to suggest that one could not acquire any of the bits of information in a collection without acquiring all of them. But Ricoeur does not think of the cognitive gains of narrative in these terms. We know this from the larger context provided by his philosophical project, the project of making sense of semantic innovation. For Ricoeur, narratives are interesting because they generate meaning by organizing information we already possess in new ways. The presence or absence of any particular piece of information is simply not germane to what narratives qua narratives do. That is why, in characterizing Ricoeur's narrativism, I have preferred to speak of understanding rather than knowledge. Understanding is a matter of grasping the significance of what we know by relating it to other things, not accumulating pieces of information. Since it is not a matter of possessing information at all, it is not the sort of thing that could appear or disappear due to the presence or absence of any particular element. Of course, our understanding of something can increase or improve, but not through the acquisition of additional pieces of information. It improves the process of relatively vague understanding being made more definite, relatively tacit understanding being further explicated, the process that Heidegger and Gadamer call the hermeneutic circle. Obviously, we might decide this is not the best way to think of what historians do, but that is a different matter than claiming that Ricoeur's view as it stands leads to absurd consequences. Finally, what about the objection that narrativism demeans historians by suggesting that they do not engage in rational argumentation? This would indeed be a worry if producing narratives, whether direct or indirect, were the only thing that historians did, but it is not. The reason is that no piece of historical scholarship exists in a vacuum. Historians produce their accounts of the past in the midst of other accounts produced by other historians. Even when no other account of a particular topic exists, the historian studying it must grapple with the fact that alternative accounts of it are always possible. So the historian does not simply produce an account of the past, she must argue for it in some way by providing evidence that this account is rationally superior to its competitors, actual or possible. Ricoeur is quite emphatic on this point. He says that historians are not simply narrators. They give reasons why they consider a particular factor rather than some other to be the sufficient cause of a given course of events. In this respect, historians differ sharply from writers of literary narratives, who also create plots that are held together by causal skeletons, but these latter are not the subject of a process of argumentation. Admittedly, Ricoeur says less than we might like about how historians argue for the superiority of their accounts over others. Presumably, they invoke the same criteria used to defend presentations in the game of giving and asking for reasons, criteria such as coherence, scope, and originality. The larger point is that while all narrativists recognize the continuities between historical and literary thinking, nothing prevents them from acknowledging the differences as well. Ricoeur's narrativism, I think, does precisely that. So far, I've argued that the criticisms that have been made of Ricoeur's narrativism are not as decisive as they might appear. That might be of interest to an audience of Ricoeur scholars, but probably not the larger group of scholars who reflect philosophically on history. Presumably, the latter group wants to know what is the best position to hold in the philosophy of history, the most rational, most defensible position. Simply knowing that Ricoeur has not been refuted does not tell us that. My final question, therefore, is this. What positive reason do we have to be drawn to Ricoeur's narrativism? Does his position have any advantage over alternate approaches? In this last section, I want to sketch an answer to that question. I want to show that Ricoeur offers something valuable that rival positions do not. Specifically, I will suggest that Ricoeur's narrativism offers a more satisfactory solution to certain problems than do his critics. While Ricoeur's position can be refined and strengthened by taking account of their criticisms, it remains a viable and powerful option in the philosophy of history today. The source of its appeal, in my view, is its comprehensiveness. Ricoeur grounds his account of narrative in a picture of one of the most fundamental features of human experience, temporality. For him, narrative is a way of humanizing the mysterious phenomenon of time. And since our experience is temporal all the way down, it bears on everything we do and are. It therefore manifests in all sorts of areas and takes on all sorts of different forms. The construction of plots that Ricoeur calls mimesis 2, but also the action structures that come before it, and the appropriative interpretations that come after it. There are implicit narratives as well as explicit ones. There are historical narratives as well as fictional ones, which means that two quite different areas of culture share a common core. Narrative, in short, is the site where very different aspects of lived experience intertwine and mutually shape one another. Since it touches on many different domains, no one domain reveals everything important about it. By contrast, Fludernik views narrative from the standpoint of one narrowly demarcated domain, what she calls natural storytelling. From that perspective, the aspect of narrative that matters most is its ability to involve its audience emotionally by successfully representing agential experientiality. This ability does indeed matter a great deal to the spontaneous storytelling that Fludernik takes as her paradigm. It is not clear that it matters so much for other kinds of narration, notably these scholarly accounts of the past offered by professional historians. Unable to account for history's importance in the terms to which she has restricted herself, Fludernik is led to say that history is bare of personal interest and far less instructive than literature. I find this conclusion implausible, and I think its implausibility is a direct result of the narrowness of her approach. Kuukkanen approaches the topic of narrative from the opposite direction. For him, I take it, it is the scholarly work of professional historians that serves as a paradigm. But while he gives a subtle and convincing account of how scholarly history does and does not make use of narrative, I have concerns about his way of accounting for the more creative and literary dimensions of narrative. I think we see the difficulties especially in his discussion of colligatory concepts, that is, historical concepts such as the Renaissance or the Cold War, that bring together diverse facts that have something in common. Colligatory concepts do not name natural kinds. They exist as such only in our thinking and talking about the past. Since that thinking and talking are constructed, Kuukkanen concludes that there is nothing real or natural in the ontological sense about these concepts, that they are not naturally given or provided by the object, the past. Colligatory concepts are not objectively given and thus do not refer to corresponding entities in historical reality. I worry about the claim that there is nothing real or natural about these concepts. To me, it risks suggesting that there is something suspect about their use, and thus about the pieces of historical scholarship that use them, which is to say, nearly all pieces of historical scholarship. There seems to be a stark either-or behind this framing of the issue. Either the reference of colligatory concepts can be shown to be real using straightforward evidentiary procedures, or they are not real at all. Since they have been made, they must be made up, that is, artificial or unreal. Ricoeur's distinctive approach to narrative allows him to say more subtle things about the concepts historians use. His position resists sharp dichotomies between the made and the made up. For Ricoeur, when historians construct explicit narratives at the level of mimesis 2, they are explicating and concretizing real structures of human action implicit at mimesis 1. These implicit structures constrain the way historians can talk at the level of mimesis 2. The configurations are not invented out of whole cloth, since they explicate and must answer to something real that pre-exists them. But that which pre-exists them is not a fully formed object passively waiting to be represented. It exists as such only once historians have configured it. A parallel relation holds between the configurations developed at the level of mimesis 2 and the refigurations they undergo at the level of mimesis 3. In both cases, the historian's productions are constrained by something real, but they transform that constraint by figuring it in a new way. Finally, in both cases, it must be possible for us to trace the higher order constructs back to their origins in lower level constructs from which they have been derived. So, are the constructs found or made? Well, both, but also neither. The question is really too crude to capture what historians do. The conclusion that I draw from all this is that there's more life in Ricoeur's philosophy of history than one might think. The criticisms that make it look passé are not as strong as they initially seem. And while they might apply to some versions of narrativism, they do not refute the subtle and sophisticated position advanced by Ricoeur. Indeed, Ricoeur's position has several advantages over its more recent rivals, and that alone is reason to take it seriously. So, how might contemporary philosophers of history go about building on Ricoeur's legacy? By way of an answer, I would like to close with two sweeping assertions. First, philosophers of history should be open to broader and more comprehensive approaches to narrative than is common today. They should not assume that any single domain on its own reveals everything important about that topic. They should be open to the suggestion that the narrative functions found in certain historical texts are manifestations of a much larger phenomenon, that before history is something we study, it is something we are. This is what Ricoeur does when he grounds his studies of both historical and fictional narrative in the phenomenology of temporal experience. It is why he has an interesting answer to the question of how history is related to literature. Rather than taking one of these domains, or a small corner of it, as paradigmatic, and then trying to model the other domain on it, Ricoeur can tell a compelling story about how each domain helps deepen our understanding of the other. My second sweeping assertion is that I think philosophers of history should be open to the strategy of linking their views of historical inquiry to a broader picture of human existence, a phenomenological or existential or hermeneutical picture. Some such approach stands the best chance of dealing with the topic in a suitably comprehensive way. I realize that this will not be a popular suggestion. Such approaches have fallen out of favor in recent decades, and while there are contemporary philosophers of history who build on them, David Carr is a distinguished example, they are not likely to become dominant anytime soon. Besides, the comprehensive sweep of this sort of philosophy is a poor fit with the hyper-specialization of today's academy. I have no idea how I might convince a funding body to give me a research grant to study what human beings are and how stories really work. So the obstacles are enormous. But if you've listened to me this long, you probably know that I'm undeterred. After all, I began my discussion of narrative by saying, in effect, back to the 1980s. It is only a little more audacious to say, as I now seem to be saying, back to the 1920s. I intend this plea in the same way Ricoeur intends his account of threefold mimesis, playfully, but also seriously. And what could be more Ricoeurian than that? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Robert. It was very interesting and enlightening. Okay, now, as said before, it's a discussion session. Is there anybody immediately who would like to comment or ask a question? If so, please indicate first in the chat or not, or by raising your hand. Well, I can also give all of you a bit of time, and I start. I mean, I'm in the role of the moderator, but I'll let you guys have a bit of time, and I'll start with the question. And I guess my question is, I know basically very little about Ricoeur, so let me be upfront about this. Do I understand you correctly that we could say via Ricoeur's analysis of narrative, we can come to something like a moderate narrative essentialism? Let me shortly explain what I think I mean by that. I think we have in the philosophy of history two sort of opposite positions. One of them who thinks like narrative is basically a superstructure. So you do the important stuff with the evidence first, that's a term from Goldstein, and then you write a narrative out of it if you have to, but you don't have to. Another extreme position might be what we refer to, Ankersmit sometimes said, or maybe Hayden White, that some parts of his career that sort of, maybe you have some kind of annal or chronicle at best before, but actually all the structure and meaning is given by the narrative. So, but if I understand now Ricoeur correctly, then he would say something like, given temporality or maybe change over time as a necessity of all human life, everything is basically narrativizable, but it doesn't need to be narrative. So if you have very descriptive historiography about, I don't know, the social structure of 1970 Canada or something like that, then I can always make a narrative out of it by relating it to before and after, but I don't need to. And I think this is a very sort of attractive position, if this is the position, because it doesn't impose narrative on everything. It doesn't make narrative into everything, but it says everything can be narrative on one level, right? Is that correct if I assume, if I summarize it that way? And if so, I would find it very attractive. But
yeah, I think that is an accurate characterization of Ricoeur's view, that not all meaning comes from narrative in the sense of explicitly constructed, expressed stories. Everything is narrativizable in the sense that all actions that historians and writers of fiction might be interested in are ones that we have to be capable of making sense of by being capable of translating them into express narrative form. So there is a kind of meaning waiting to be found in the actions themselves, thanks to the nature of action, the teleological nature of action, and the temporal character of human experience. So yeah, that I think you've characterized Ricoeur's view accurately, and I think that's precisely the source of its appeal to me. That it doesn't go as far as to say, as someone like White might say, that all the meaning is a matter of explicit construction, not constrained by anything. But nevertheless, there aren't fully formed explicit stories out there waiting to be represented as they really are. There's a mix of reconstruction and construction. So I think my answer in short is yes.
Okay, so,
could
thank
I
you very much. Yes.
Could I redirect your question? Is that I said at the beginning that I'm not as familiar with with recent work in the philosophy of history as pretty much everyone here is, I'm sure. Are you? Is the view you described, the sort of modern of narrative essentialism, as you called it, is that a view that is held by others working today?
We could also ask the rest. It's a view I hold myself, and I just came up with that term. So I mean, I hope it is helpful. We can discuss it. But my little question did the trick. We now have two other people who would like to speak. First, it's Jouni-Matti, and then it's Alex Obrigewicz. I hope this is correct.
Yeah. Obrigewicz.
Jouni-Matti, please. Yes, thank you.
Yes, first of all, do you hear me? Because
I do, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, many thanks for the excellent lecture. I enjoyed it, and also thanks for portraying me so fairly. It was a fair portrayal of what I was doing in the post-narratives philosophy of historiography. I guess I could start by adding two other issues. Why? I mean, you're totally right. I didn't really analyze Ricoeur, so there isn't much there. I'm not a Ricoeur scholar, so I don't know inside out, and for that reason, it's very useful to get that. The reason why I didn't engage, one is, well, was surely work economical, but another was that I put Ricoeur in the category of phenomenological narrativism, and I still think that ought to be fairly accurate on the basis of what's your lecture, and that is because he talks about the time as a condition of human experiencing and stuff like that, and that sounded to me, and still sounds to me, it's a transcendental issue whether we as humans, what we are, how do we experience? Do we experience time necessarily in one way or another? And I, for one, don't have a view of that, and I'm not sure how Ricoeur arrives at this view, because it's a metaphysics for me, and I kind of squared it out, and the focus was on the philosophy of historiography, or the philosophy of history writing and research. And I also have seen, this was actually when I now checked that Manslow talked about hardwiring of human experiencing, which is another thing. I don't know whether our brains are hardwired to experience time in one way or another. Those are particular reasons. So I don't do that. I didn't want to do that. Still, I'm very happy if you find Ricoeur basically compatible with the or that is able to answer the problems that I picked up from the narrative. I guess I just end with the question, because I received a phone call, which I didn't answer, but it distracted me when you're coming to the first point about essential narrativism, that Ricoeur is able to answer the accusation what I had, that if every presentation of history has to be narrative and there are no narrative histories. Was that the view that Georg also referred to, that everything is narrativizable, but not necessarily in the narrative form? That's what Ricoeur thinks?
Yeah, that's right. So he draws a distinction between what he calls narrative history and the narrative character of history, where narrative history refers to histories, or refers to the idea that all historical texts must take the form of explicit stories. And that's a view of which he has very low opinion, because he thinks it makes historical inquiry unscientific and doesn't leave any room for objectivity, any room for explanation by laws. So he thinks that, yeah, there's no requirement at all that all history be expressly in the form of story, but he thinks that it must all be translatable into narrative form, that if we are capable of learning something from a piece of historical scholarship, it is on some level because we can schematize it with the structures of human temporal experience. Most of the time, we don't bother to translate these stories into, or these implicit stories, narrativizable stories, into explicit narrative. But he thinks that we must be capable of doing so. And that's why, for example, he sees the work of the annals historians as being narrative in character, in the sense that they contain implicit stories that could be explicated into narrative form, but that we probably won't bother to do so. So yes, I think that, again, like my response to Georg, I think my response is yes. I think that is his view. I'm glad that you think my reconstruction reviews was fair. I was worried that it wouldn't be. And I appreciate very much the decision to put to one side the transcendental questions about the conditions of the possibility of historical scholarship. Because once you open the floodgates to those questions, you end up doing the sort of thing that Ricoeur does, namely spending decades and decades writing ever bigger books, trying to get to the ever more fundamental foundations of the particular local phenomena that interests you. And that, I mean, that way is viable only for, someone like Ricoeur. It's certainly not viable for me. So I certainly understand the impulse to put the transcendental questions to one side, just as I understand the impulse to put questions about hardwiring to one side. I suppose what I'm betraying in this talk is a certain kind of nostalgia for old-fashioned transcendental philosophy, and then I do feel that once we abandon that game, even though we have excellent reasons for doing so, there's a certain kind of comprehensiveness in our self-understanding that is going to be lost to us. And I suppose that may be inevitable. It may be that the kind of comprehensive, transcendentally grounded phenomenological philosophy of history that Ricoeur represents is something to which we have to say goodbye. But I feel a real loss if that is the case. But I do sympathize, and I certainly have no illusions of trying to do that myself.
Thanks. I could come back to collocation, but let others speak first.
Yes, right. Next is Alex Obrigowicz, I hope I said that correctly.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob, for your presentation. Extremely clear as always. And as someone, as you know, that is similarly amenable to the sort of transcendental questions, I have a few parts to this question. The first that I'm wondering is the humanizing of time also in a certain way the temporalizing of the human, right? That it's constitutively or transcendentally conditioning our existence, in that sense that this potential narrativity or the figurational element is something transcendentally essential to what it is to be human. And if Ricoeur might be amenable to something like that, it seems to me another way of relating what he's doing to the work of Philippe Lacour-Labart, who is not, I assume, usually taken to be someone who does the philosophy of history, but in the early 2000s, he had a book on it was The Poetics of History, where it's grounded a lot in ideas taken from Aristotle. And so herein sort of comes my second question is, given Ricoeur's the importance of something like plot, we could take this back to mythos in Aristotle, and as well as mimesis, is Aristotle's Poetics, I suppose, an important text or an important sort of foundation for Ricoeur and Ricoeur's thinking. And I ask this in a certain sense because Lacour-Labart takes the Poetics not simply to be a text in aesthetics or something like that, but a metaphysical and ontologically important text. And especially in terms of the beginnings of chapter 4 of the Poetics, where mimesis is taken as the grounds for methesis, right? Whether we want to take that as knowledge or theoria or for understanding, right? And how we understand mimesis obviously is important here, which I think Ricoeur's 3 levels of mimesis. It has certain ways that we could relate to Lacour-Labart's idea of mimesis and figuration. Don't want to go into that because obviously that's not what we're talking about. But yeah, in short, is the humanizing of time also entailing the temporalizing of the human, this sort of transcendental question? And then I guess the importance or the position of Aristotle's Poetics for Ricoeur.
Thank you, Alex. 2 great questions, as always. Let me start with the second one. Short answer, yes. The Aristotle's Poetics is a very important text for Ricoeur's position here. And in fact, I gave a fairly one-sided reconstruction of the early chapters of Time and Narrative because I emphasized his reading of Augustine in pointing out one dimension of temporal experience as mysterious, as aporetic. There are actually 2 texts that he takes as foundational in steering the project of Time and Narrative. Chapter 1 deals with Augustine. Chapter 2 deals with Aristotle's Poetics. And they're meant to present the 2 curiously related sides of temporal experience. That on the one hand, when we try to theorize about it, we run into the same difficulties that Augustine did. We can't say what time is. We can't give a coherent account of how to measure time. But nevertheless, and in some tension with that, we do manage to deal with time quite confidently. We do manage to make sense of our lives. We do manage to make sense of historical events by shaping them into structures with explicit plots. So Aristotle and Augustine are sort of engaged in a tug of war throughout Time and Narrative, in that he's trying to deal with these 2 aspects of temporality. Its mysterious nature, but also our undaunted confidence in humanizing it. So I gave a sort of a one-sided presentation and emphasizing only the first. But yes, you're absolutely right. And like Lacour-Labart, he does see that text as above all an ontological one, which touches on some of the issues that I was dealing with towards the end of the talk. That narrative, before being something that we write, it's something that we are, in a sense. And I think one of Ricoeur's core convictions in this topic is that we'll misunderstand narrative and go down blind alleys if we don't recognize it as having ontological significance. Now, your first question having to do with the humanizing of time and the temporalizing of the human. I think my answer is yes. I think Ricoeur says, I'm not sure. I think Ricoeur believes that when we humanize time through the process of narrating historical events or our lives, that is a way of temporalizing the human in the sense of making the temporal dimension of human existence more fully itself, more real by applying it. So I think it involves the same sort of process that Gadamer would call transformation into structure, that there is a sort of an implicit temporality in human action, in all human experience all the way down. There's no non-temporal or pre-temporal level experience. There is no requirement that those pre-temporal or pre-theoretical levels be explicitly narrative or narrated. But Ricoeur seems to think that to the extent that we are not on the way to explicating that implicit side of our being, we are less than fully ourselves, that the temporality of our existence is less fully real than it is when it is explicitly narrated, in much the same way that the meaning of a text is not as fully concretized until I apply it to my own situation and my own existential concerns. Is that the sort of neighborhood that you had in mind?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks, Rob. That's great.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm speculating here, but I think that is his view. That I think follows from the tripartite structure of mimesis. So I'm not certain, but that would be a plausible reading of Ricoeur to me.
Yeah, okay. That's what I was thinking, but I wanted to pass by you, so thanks.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Great questions.
Yes, thank you both. Now, I know that Jouni-Matti is a follow-up on colligations, but is there anybody else who hasn't spoken yet? Who has a question or comment first? Well, I guess they can think still further, so Jouni-Matti, you first about colligations or whatever you want.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I want to do a little defense of the approach regarding colligation there. I think the starting point is nominalism. So I'm a nominalist, thinking roughly bits and particles are there, but when it comes to categorizations, they are not carved out in any sense of natural kinds or in the Platonic carving the joints kind of sense. Therefore, what I would require from, because I'm suspicious about talk about real or being real, because I don't know what is the philosophical contribution of taking something as real insofar it's justified or constructed responsibly with warrant or anything like that. If we wanted to come to this real talk of the realism as it's in the philosophy of science, for example, then I think it would require arguing for two points. One is the independence condition, that the colligations or categorizations are independent of the historian. And additionally, I think it would require arguing for uniqueness condition, that they're somehow uniquely correct. And I think it's very hard to make either of these arguments. And even more so, I'm committed to nominalism. I don't see a route there. And therefore, we are left with the idea of them not being given by the past or not being, real in the sense. But again, I don't know what the realism talk really can add here. What is missing, and I think it should be done, this account requires more attention, colligation in historiography, whether it's possible to build something like, to come up with something like a logic of construction or some principled way, because I don't think you can just put, in whatever way them together. So therefore, I actually took very seriously the metaphor of constructivism. So we can build a house, but we can make very poor houses, poor buildings, and much better buildings, and buildings that simply fall. And so that's the kind of metaphors I would be playing around. And of course, there are some principles, some logic, some materials that you can put together, and some better and some much worse. That's the beat, probably.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And you give me a lot to think about here. And I'm certainly very sympathetic to suspicion of reality talk. I mean, like you, I think that I think we probably have shared sympathies to certain pragmatist approaches of the topic of reality.
Yeah.
And I think, like you, I'm often suspicious that references to what's real actually clarifies very much in philosophical discussion generally. So I'm very sympathetic to that point as well. I suppose one way to describe the concerns I was raising was that I was hoping to suggest that we should be consistent or in our suspicions of reality talk. That if we're not willing to say that our collocations are real in a specific sense, we also shouldn't draw the conclusion that they're unreal in the sense of being made up or artificial or not natural or something. I'd like to be an equal opportunity debunker of reality talk. If we don't want to say that these collocations are real, I'd be happy also saying that they're not unreal, that the real unreal terminology simply need not apply. Now, as for Ricoeur's view here, I guess I'd really like to hear what you think about Ricoeur's way of trying to square this particular circle. The criteria that a realist account would have to meet, you sketch. You mentioned the independence criterion and the uniqueness criterion. I think that within certain limits, Ricoeur would be happy accepting both of those criteria. I think that if we're willing to accept with Ricoeur that colligation takes place at the second of the three levels, mimesis 2, the level at which we are explicitly constructing narratives or explanations or something. The colligations in which we construct at that stage are not going to be uniquely correct in the sense that there isn't going to be simply one way of carving up the elements of temporal experience. I think, even though Ricoeur says that explicit narratives which take place at the level of mimesis 2, they're answerable to these pre-narrative structures at mimesis 1, but not in the sense that there is one and only one uniquely correct way of hashing out what happens at mimesis 1 at the level of mimesis 2. So I think Ricoeur will be very suspicious of the uniqueness condition. He would also, I think, be suspicious of the independence requirement in the sense that, well, in one sense, the structures of mimesis 1 are independent in the sense that they're not made by storytelling, but they're not independent in the sense that they don't exist as such outside narratives. They are present as a sort of a germinal form, but they exist as such in the same sort of way that, for Aquinas, a universal exists only as universal in the form of an abstract idea in the intellect. It doesn't exist in things themselves. So if we use these two criteria of realism, then I think Ricoeur is not going to be a realist in the sense that we're describing here. But again, I think he would push back against the assumption that real, unreal are particularly useful concepts to apply here, or ones that should be used without further qualification. I think he's more interested in qualifying the senses in which we might mean that one of these things is real or not. Real in a sense, but not real in a sense. I think I've lost my thread a little bit. I'm not sure that I'm any longer addressing your concerns.
Yeah, maybe yeah. Thank you. Just a brief comment back. I mean, I agree about the point about, you know, avoiding real and unreal, and I think that's the way to pragmatism. I mean, yes, I fully agree about that. Oh, of course, we can take either of them as linguistic predicates, but then we need to explicate what kind of linguistic work we are going to do. This is real, so I'm kind of making performative act that believe me or trust me, or, you know, this is how it is, or anything like that. But that's a totally different ballgame, I think.
Yeah.
So there are.
Can I ask a question of you?
Agreement. Yeah.
Do you think that perhaps the predicate real might play a role in a higher order discourse in which we are trying to justify engaging in the game of giving and asking for reasons that historians do? I mean, I agree that concepts like real and true don't do much justificatory work when historians are playing the game of giving and asking for reasons. But I can imagine someone claiming that when we are at a different level of discourse, explaining why that game is a worthwhile one to play, we might then want to motivate the playing of it by talking about something like the discovery of truth or the discovery of what's real. In the sense that if we didn't in any sense think that playing the game of giving and asking for reasons, as historians do, if we didn't think that that led to anything more than different accounts that all have warranted assertability, we would lose an important motive for engaging in it, because all disagreement would be, so to speak, no fault. If you and I can justify our views equally well, there's no reason for us to engage in discussion to refine our views, because there's no sense that there's anything wrong in our having different views that are, as long as they're justified. Again, I feel like I may have lost my thread again, but do you think that there might be a role for these concepts at a different level of discourse in talking about the game?
Well, perhaps. I'm not going to say categorically no, there isn't, although I still would want to see what function, and specifically function. I'm talking about linguistic functions. What linguistic function it would serve. And the best way I could think of is falling back to Sellars, actually, all the way from random to Sellars, who I think defines truth as something like semantic assertability. So that kind of approach might work with real, but still we would need to see whether what's again function, pragmatic function for that thought. So yeah, and then this brings me to Rorty, actually. I would be, as a pragmatist, suspicious again of making the move then from, even with something is semantically highly assertable, or I don't know what the qualification would be, assertable, to saying that that's how it is without anybody having been asserted. I don't see that move. So I think I would always, you know, even if it's not mentioned specifically, I would give that. So it's, even if it's a very highly warranted or highly assertive thing.
Yeah, I agree. And it may be that is one of the points at which a pragmatist like Rorty and a hermeneutical thinker like Ricoeur have a fundamental disagreement, in that for a philosopher like Ricoeur, the reality with which he is concerned is, from the beginning, a human reality. A reality mediated by a sort of a meaning-generating existential engagement in the world. So there's going to be a different sense for a philosopher like Ricoeur to the question of would these things have existed if no one talked about them or asserted them? The question of where we would have to look to make sense of that is, I think, going to be different for someone like Ricoeur than it will be for someone like Rorty. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Do you one more question? Do you not feel uneasy, as I take you as a pragmatist as well, uneasy about Ricoeur's transcendental approach, because he seems to be free reaching somewhere that pragmatists mostly don't want to go, although some might.
Yeah, I feel uneasy about a lot of things, and I feel uneasy about lots of elements of pragmatism as well. So yeah, I mean, Alex has heard me talk a great deal about this. I mean, I'm very aware, and I'm very concerned about the plausibility of engaging straightforwardly in a transcendental philosophical project today. I mean, I do have moments where I think something like a radically revised transcendental project is unavoidable. But absolutely, I'm very uneasy by that. Just as I'm very uneasy about certain elements of Rorty's pragmatism, as much as I admire it. It's one of the reasons I don't sleep very well as a philosopher. But I do see both of these approaches, I suppose, as tools to use in various ways, from various contexts, for various purposes. And I try not to focus too much on the things that give me pause, but certainly there are, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much both for your exchange. Okay, talking about time, it is already quite advanced, but we still have a bit of time. So I would have another question, but is there somebody else in the audience who has a question or comment, concern, criticism? I think I'll quickly ask my question, then I give one more chance to the audience. It sort of relates to what has just been asked. I like the idea of the comprehensiveness concerning narrative. So it's obvious to me. I mean, everybody knows that there's not just historiographic narrative. There's literary narratives, and people narrativize their lives all the time, and they do it for very different purposes and arguably very different rules and for very different. But then my question is still again, you said Ricoeur's narrativism gives us perhaps understanding and not knowledge. And I find this is intriguing, because this seems to connect different notions of narrative. Because this is also then the question of narrative as a cognitive instrument, or whatever has been called, beyond sort of only knowledge. But then, of course, in my understanding of historiography, I always like to have one leg down in the evidence, so have sort of evidentiary concerns. So my question would be, again, as somebody who doesn't know Ricoeur very well, is there in Ricoeur a place for some narratives, at least, some historiographic narratives on some level, like some causal narratives, are evidentiary justified, evidentiary based, therefore they produce knowledge of the past? Of course, you need to infer that. And they're not just giving us understanding. And understanding is great too. I mean, I'm very happy to have parts of narratives, or some narratives that give more understanding and some give more knowledge, or somehow the intermesh, even historiographic text, and it's unclear. Nobody knows yet. You would really have to look at individual narratives, how they do that. And, a lot of people say, not a lot of people, somebody says literature is or something like that is a lie that tells the truth, which I would cash out as understanding. You understand something by, or some literature does. Maybe a lot of historiography does that as well. But still, I feel I would, at least for some historiographic narratives, I would like to have one leg down in the evidence. They are evidentially justified, therefore to produce knowledge too, and maybe also understanding. Or maybe we have narratives who produce only knowledge, and some who produce more understanding, and therefore more configurational and so forth. Is that a way of? So the question is, I guess, does Ricoeur make room for that? And what do you think about this? Is that narratives can produce knowledge and understanding to different degrees, or some narratives to one and some to the other?
Yeah. Yeah, short answer is absolutely. Ricoeur stresses this this aspect of narrative exhaustively, at great length, over and over again. When I at one point in the paper, I said that we should perhaps think of one of the things that understanding does. So I'm just noticing that the light from my window is reflecting in my face. Should I adjust the blind? It's probably a little distracting.
As you wish, yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Oh, no, that's worse. That's maybe better. Okay. Yes. Nope, that's not better. Maybe I can try to move. How's that?
Better, yes.
Okay, and now it's moved on a different part of my body. Yeah, I mean, I said at one point that although I was suggesting we think of narrative as generating understanding rather than explanation, Ricoeur would resist that claim. And Ricoeur says over and over again that explanation and understanding are not antithetical. They're dialectically interrelated. You can't have one without the other, and each one enhances the other. So what Ricoeur is very keen to say about historical narratives is that there must always be an element of explanation. He, because of, I think, his period, thinks of explanation in terms of general laws, and isn't really open to other sorts of explanation. But he's very adamant that if you have history as a scholarly scientific inquiry, you must allow a role for explanation in terms of general laws and evidentiary considerations. Otherwise, history is just literature. So it was something of an exaggeration or a simplification, in my view, to say that narrative should be seen more as offering understanding than explanation, because Ricoeur sees them as inseparable. I mean, I guess I was doing that in a specific context in which, as I saw it, the importance of narrative, the importance of knowledge had been sort of overemphasized, and the importance of understanding had been underemphasized. So in saying that, I was trying to correct an imbalance, but I was misrepresenting Ricoeur's view if I suggested, as I did, that it's all about understanding and not at all about explanation, and not all about evidence. Now, the question of what role evidentiary considerations play in historical inquiry for Ricoeur is a very messy one. Volume 2 of Time and Narrative deals at great length with some fairly narrow debates among philosophers of history in the 70s and 80s. And he advances a very subtle view of the way in which historical evidence enters into historical inquiry. One in which narratives refer to reality, but not directly. They refer to it through the mediation of documents that are to be understood as something like traces or stand-ins or substitutes for the past. I won't try to summarize that view here, because it's as I said, a very difficult and very subtle view. All I guess I want to suggest is that Ricoeur is certainly very aware of the importance of evidence in historical inquiry. And even though I suggested that he downplays that, he really doesn't. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Now I want to look at volume 2 of Time and Narrative, given my interest in evidence. But as I said before, to make true that, one more chance for anybody to ask questions, raise concerns, have criticisms.
I'm sorry, I've shifted back again because I didn't think it was much of an improvement to be positioned in a different place. I'm sorry about the strange reflection. Take it as a sign from above.
Well, maybe it is. I don't see anybody immediately having a question anymore. So I guess it's time now to close. I thank you, everybody in the audience. Thank you specifically you, Robert, for presenting here with us today. And of course, happy holidays. And we will have our next seminar. As I said, our seminar continues in February with the spring seminar. And information about that will be available in the new year on our homepage and our social media accounts. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all very much.